Thank you very much, Ed. My name is Mark Williams, the chair of the Political Science Department. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here for our lecture this afternoon, in which Peter Kornbluh will be speaking to us. Peter is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive in Washington. Most of his current work centers upon Cuba, Chile, and as well as Venezuela. For about a decade, from 1990 to 1999, Peter taught at Columbia University, and he's authored a number of books and monographs, or he's edited a number as well. His articles have appeared in such venues as Foreign Policy, the New York Times, New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and so forth. He's also worked on or appeared in a variety of documentary films, including an Oscar-winning Panama Deception documentary, the History Channel's Bay of Pigs Declassified, and The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Currently, he is a weekly columnist for a Chilean newspaper, Diario Siete, and today he's going to talk to us on this topic, After Fidel, Cuba, Venezuela, and the challenges to American policy in Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Peter Kornbluh to Middlebury.
Thank you so much. Let me just see if we can get this set up first. There we go. And we'll proceed from there. I appreciate the invitation to come today to Middlebury. I don't think I've been here before, and obviously it's a lovely place. When I found out there was a cemetery next door, I decided I better wear a suit. But I don't usually dress like this, particularly on college campuses. So I'm really not trying to win your respect or your disrespect by wearing a tie. You know, this is a very timely moment to have this discussion. And why is that? On December 3rd, this Sunday, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela will be elected again. Actually for the third time, plus a recall vote, which he also won. He will be the principal mover and shaker in his own country with this election and in the region until at least the year 2013, and conceivably significantly longer if one is to believe the type of positions that he has taken on his interest in staying on as president of Venezuela. More notably, on December 2nd, this coming Saturday, we will witness the 50th anniversary of the landing of a small wooden yacht that sailed from Mexico, from the east coast of Mexico, to Cuba. This was an extraordinarily historical moment. The initial step in the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. The Granma, I don't know how many of you have been to Havana and actually seen the ship, which is in a huge glass case. How many have been there and seen the ship? One person, more? And it is a monument that they have kept there, and it certainly is a monument to the history of Cuba and to the history of revolution in Latin America and to the history of U.S. Latin American relations. It marked, as I pointed out, the beginning of the progression of events that led to Fidel Castro's taking power on January 1st, 1959. It marked the beginning of what became the prominent FOCO theory of revolution in Latin America that Che Guevara was able to immortalize. So why was that? There was about 118 guerrilleros on the Granma. Their passage to Cuba and their landing was hardly a secret, and Fulgencio Batista knew they were coming and attacked the boat almost from the moment it landed on the beach. And almost every member of the expedition was actually killed at that time, minus about 18 or 19 fighters, among them Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. And out of those 18 survivors who melted into the Sierra Maestra and began a 2-year campaign of revolution, came the legend of how a small force of guerrilla fighters could incite an uprising and overthrow of a dictator like Fulgencio Batista. There are some issues about that history if you're really interested in it. There was quite a bit of movement in the urban sectors of Havana and Santiago and Trinidad as well. So it wasn't just that 18 fighters began this revolution. There was a lot more to the history than that. But the legend derived from the landing of the Granma 50 years ago this Saturday. And of course, at the same time, December 2nd is also the day that Fidel Castro designated to be the commemoration of his 80th birthday. He turned 80 in August, but when he got sick in late July and underwent surgery, he asked that the commemoration of his birthday, which was going to be a national party, be postponed till December 2nd to correspond with the 50th anniversary of the landing of the Granma. Now, that's a significant milestone for himself. By postponing it to this coming Saturday, Castro has set up a situation in which all Cubans are watching, many people in Miami, and a healthy number in Washington as well, to see if he actually makes an appearance on December 2nd. I'm sorry? He has announced that he won't. I've been flying all day, so I've missed the announcement. I was going to say, actually, that I was going to predict that he would not appear. And thanks to you, I sound like I have some wisdom. But and he may not actually appear then physically as part of the parade. It still remains to be seen if on Saturday there are new photographs of him released or even a video appearance that he might make, and if so, in what actual condition he is in. I was actually in Havana 2 weeks ago, precisely to ascertain what the situation was with Fidel's health and what the response of the country and the government was to this situation. And I want to share with you a little bit of what I found, and you would be the first group that I've actually spoken to about this. I was able, because of work that I've been doing over the last 10 years with Cuba, which included organizing 2 major conferences, one on the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs and one on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that included bringing down CIA folk, the retired Kennedy White House officials, and a number of scholars, and meeting with Fidel Castro and his comandantes and the surviving members of his government that participated in that history. Because of that work, because I've met with him and met with Raul and know all of his top aides, I was able to go back 2 weeks ago and try and engage in some high-level meetings to find out what the situation is. And this is what I came back with. One, the nature of his illness. The CIA has said that its analysis he has terminal cancer, intestinal cancer. They really have no inside intelligence of any kind. And people close to Castro told me that he does have what he said he had originally, which is a serious case of diverticulitis. This is an extraordinarily difficult and painful disease, which essentially is the weakening of the walls of the intestines, such that what's in the intestines begins to leak through. It's very difficult to contain. He announced that he was having surgery in late July, but I was told that he had a second surgical procedure as well thereafter. He's had 2 operations and is fighting internal infections deriving from this disease. This would account for his weight loss, the fact that he doesn't seem to be recovering, the fact that he's disappeared for significant periods of time. And the consensus was that he was still gravely ill, even though there's been an attempt to post some photographs of him talking and being in bed and to imply that he is recovering. That was the first thing I learned. The second thing I was able to observe is that there is a distinct calmness to the transition of power that has taken place. There seems to be no upheaval, dissension, disagreement within the institutions that are now running Cuba. And in this period of time, between the end of July and now, it appears that the revolution is not simply the power of one particular individual and or his brother, but that the long-term institutions, some of which we don't see very clearly from afar, and most notably the Cuban Communist Party, really running the show both at the top of the government and on the street. The other thing I came away with in talking to people there, both inside the government and outside the government — I have a lot of friends who are in academia in Cuba and are analysts — I was able to meet with all the ambassadors from the leading countries that are represented in Cuba to find out what they thought about the situation, so that my information would come from a variety of sources. But there seemed to be in Cuba, from outside and inside the government, a certain degree of confidence in the future, rather than a concern and a fear about what Castro's passing might yield in Cuba. There seemed to be a certain confidence about the future. There was a consensus that Fidel was unlikely to return to power, and that power has passed to Raúl and to the top aides that they appointed. But there also seemed to be a consensus that Cuba is not on the brink of a breakdown, and that it feels more confident than ever and less alone than ever in its position in the region and the world. This, in the end, was inevitable to this passing, whether it's a passing of power or Fidel's actual physical passing from this earth. There was a lot of people in Miami and elsewhere who I think had come to believe that the guy was never going to die and never could die. And inside Cuba, he has been around for so long and dominant figure for so long that it also seemed to be difficult to believe that he could become gravely ill like this. But in fact, the Cuban government has been planning for this very kind of scenario for a long time. And for them, this was the perfect kind of evolution of this scenario. Castro gets sick. He is able to openly transfer power to his brother. He is still kind of behind the scenes and can still make appearances to calm people, to assure them that chaos is not going to break out. The Cuban government is able to view the U.S. response, what it is, what it isn't, what the United States is able to do, what it can't do, as well as the response in Miami, despite hostility of the Bush administration, despite kind of the written plan that this administration has had that explicitly says we are dedicated to preventing this type of succession of power, despite the commitment to regime change in Washington, Washington's commitment to regime change in Cuba. One can see that the latitude and ability of the United States to affect the situation has been minimal. This is what my friend and colleague Julia Zweig of the Council on Foreign Relations calls Fidel's final victory over the United States. That is the title of an article that she has written for Foreign Affairs that will be posted on the website of the Council on Foreign Relations tomorrow and will be out in the April issue. It's an interesting assessment of the fact that for all that the United States hoped for all that the exile community hoped for in the moment that Fidel left power, Castro has been able to engineer this transfer with the most minimal of disruption. This is, as I mentioned, not what the exile community wanted. I was working with a reporter after Castro got sick. And I said to him, you should go interview Orlando Bosch. Orlando Bosch is, along with Luis Posada Carriles, the godfather of anti-Castro Cuban violence, the effort to overthrow Fidel Castro through violent means, including uses of sabotage, bombing planes, etc. And I thought it would be an interesting story to see what Bosch's perspective was on this. And of course, the reporter went to Bosch, who's living in Miami, and said, Castro seems to be dying from natural causes. What do you think of this? And the answer was, of course, he can't die. He has to be here so I can kill him. We've worked so hard for the moment in which we could be responsible for getting rid of him. And it's wrong that nature would take its course this way. The situation in Cuba obviously leaves in the United States with both an opportunity and for change in Cuba and an opportunity for change in U.S. policy. It has surprised the United States government, I think, to see what has happened in Cuba. It has run against the assessments that at least the kind of ideological policymakers had in Washington about what would happen when Castro himself left the scene. The assumption that the Cuban Revolution would disintegrate without Castro is one that dates back almost all the way to the beginning, almost all the way to the first years after the revolution, when the whole Bay of Pigs invasion was formulated on the assumption that all the United States had to do was land a small brigade of fighters on the beach, and the Cuban public would rise up and overthrow Castro. It dates back to the earliest efforts to assassinate Castro, that if you could just decapitate the leadership, the entire revolution would disintegrate. This 50 years, of course, has been dominated by what Henry Kissinger called a perpetual hostility in the U.S. position towards Cuba. It has been an extraordinary 50 years for anybody who's interested in U.S.-Latin American relations and U.S.-Cuban relations. And I just wanted to remind you with a few declassified documents that we've been able to pull together at my office of some of what this history was about. You had the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961, which was the overt U.S. effort to overthrow the Cuban Revolution after some initial covert efforts had failed. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs, you had Operation Mongoose, which has come to be a famous code name for a broad set of overt and covert pressures against Cuba to create kind of turmoil on the island, upheaval, and incite the overthrow of Castro. You had Cuba's response to this pressure, an alliance with the Soviet Union, a decision to allow the Soviets to place intermediate-range nuclear missiles on the island. Castro believed that this would be his contribution to strengthening the socialist bloc and to deterring a second Bay of Pigs, which he believed was coming from reports by Cuban intelligence on the Operation Mongoose. The missile crisis, of course, was a defining moment in the Cold War. Here's one of the this is one of the actual surveillance reconnaissance pictures from a U-2 of Soviet trucks lined up at a site where the silos were being built. Sorry. You had the contingency planning for coups in Cuba, and just a general ongoing effort in the 1960s to overthrow Fidel Castro by hook or by crook. You had, of course, in the 1960s, Castro's effort to incite insurrection in other parts of Latin America. This was done through a variety of ways, training guerrillas from countries like Nicaragua. The earliest Sandinistas in the 1960s went to Cuba, the Dominican Republic, some forces in Venezuela. You had Che Guevara's foray into other countries, including an effort in Argentina that he did not attend himself, but which was thwarted. And then, of course, his effort in the later 1960s in Bolivia. This is the memo to President Lyndon Johnson a couple of days after Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia. And you can see down there the second half of this memo, the description of what this, which I would argue is probably the only substantive victory of the United States over Cuba in the last 50 years, what this meant to U.S. policymakers. It would thwart future efforts by Castro to incite this type of revolution. It would undermine the appeal of this model in Latin America, and it would show that the United States counterinsurgency operations were serious and should be reckoned with. This is the type of issues that went on from the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s in Africa and Central America. But these have not been serious issues, if issues at all, in U.S.-Cuban relations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was in Havana in 1992 for the 30th anniversary conference on the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Castro declared, and he declared this in part because the retired Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara demanded that it be said at this conference, that it be made clear that Cuba was no longer going to be in the business of internal subversion and fomenting insurrection. Of course, there were very few forces in Latin America by then to go ahead and do this, and Cuba itself was now abandoned, bereft of the aid from the Soviet Union, and basically on its own at that moment. It was what they called the special period. There was no gasoline, there was very little food, it was difficult to get electricity. I was in Cuba then, and most people were simply riding bicycles. The big gain in those years was that the Chinese had decided to donate up to 1 million bicycles and build a bicycle factory in Cuba during those years. But the point was that Cuba was a very different place, and the international situation was very, very different. And yet, that was in the early 1990s. We're all the way into the 21st century now, and U.S.-Cuban relations have remained basically stuck in that past. Is this because of the international issues? Not really. It is because Cuba occupies a very special place domestically in the United States. And Cuba has become, it has been for a long time, but even more so since the collapse of the Soviet Union, largely and mainly a domestic political issue, held hostage to the electoral votes of one state, and that is Florida. Those of you who followed the presidential election of 2000 and noted what happened in Florida might not have come to analyzing that issue from a kind of U.S.-Cuba relations perspective. But if George Bush actually won in Florida, he won by about 500 votes. That meant that any small group of interests could have swung that. And the main interests that vote as a bloc, of course, in Florida is the Cuban-American community. They vote less and less as a bloc over these years, but by and large, this is why you will see even Democratic Party candidates being very conservative and almost rhetorically interventionist in their prose on Cuba during an election, because it only takes 1,000 or so of the Cuban-American community to vote for a Democrat or vote for a Republican and perhaps swing an election. And that was reinforced, that message was reinforced in the year 2000. We no longer have national security interests with Cuba, for the most part, but the policy remains as hostile as ever. In this last period of time, the last 10 years, the United States passed the Helms-Burton Amendment, clamping down on foreign investment in Cuba, starting to restrain even more travel towards Cuba, and mandating that even if Fidel Castro left power If Raul Castro or a couple of the other communist leaders in Cuba assumed power, then the United States would be limited by law in what kind of aid it could extend and what kind of influence it could play in the transfer and the changes that will obviously be forthcoming on the island. There's no doubt that there will be change on the island. People can argue, and we can discuss this afterwards, whether Raul is any different from Fidel. We have to remember that he is essentially a transitional person in any event because he is 75 years old. And it is hard to imagine that he will actually head the Cuban government for more than 3 or 4 or 5 years at best. There is a whole younger generation of leaders in Cuba, and they are going to see the world very differently. They did not participate in this 50-year history the same way that Fidel Castro and Raul Castro did. We have a new situation forthcoming in Cuba, and we have a new situation in all of Latin America, frankly, which is important to remember that Cuba is in that context as well. One of the ultimate ironies, I think, of the situation with Fidel's passing is that Cuba is actually less isolated than at any time since 1959. There are more other governments that see the world, not perhaps in the same extreme terms or rhetorical terms as the Cuban revolutionary leaders, but certainly see the United States in similar terms, see the international financial system with a degree of hostility, and are again revisiting the issue of expropriating national resources and driving a much harder bargain with foreign investors in their countries over those resources. You have similar-minded people in Argentina, in Uruguay. We just had a progressive economist elected in Ecuador this past week. Obviously, the return of Daniel Ortega is a very interesting phenomena, even though, in my personal opinion, having worked very hard on U.S.-Nicaraguan relations in the 1980s, I don't see this portending anything of significance for change in Nicaragua, for change in the region. But clearly you have a situation where there are many other countries, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Lula in Brazil, and of course we come to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez, the person who's going to assume, and it feels that he has assumed, the mantle of regional agitator, rhetorical revolutionary, model for change. He sees himself as the friend, the ally, and the heir apparent, and actually really the heir real at this point of Fidel Castro. For those of us who kind of are Cuba watchers, it's been interesting to note that almost every piece of information on Castro's health since July 31st has come in a coordinated way with a visit by Hugo Chavez to Havana, to Fidel's bedside. The first photographs of Fidel recovering from his surgery came with Hugo Chavez right there. The second piece of information about his recovery came from Chavez making certain statements, and then again Chavez came back and more videotape was released of the both of them together. And obviously there's a message there for us and for the world, and for Cubans, for Latin Americans, for the United States. And that is that there is a close relationship between Chavez and Castro, and that the two of them are obviously tied together. There are some similarities between these two men. They both plotted coups and failed in their first endeavor to assume power. And then they went at it again, both in different ways, and eventually achieved power. Both are socialists. Fidel didn't declare himself to be a socialist until sometime after he took power. Chavez is kind of getting around to it much more forcefully right now as he's on the verge of being elected to another term. They have clearly both brought kind of the flourish of anti-American rhetoric to new heights. And when you listen to Chavez and you listen to Fidel's old speech, you see in a similar type of anger there, a similar type of disrespect and forcefulness towards the United States. But I think we should make no mistake. There are significant differences between these two individuals and their circumstances. Hugo Chavez was democratically elected, not once, not twice, but now 3 times, and if you count the recall, 4 times. He has had, up until now, a legitimacy of being elected in what all international observers have said were fair elections that Castro himself didn't have. Venezuela did not have a major revolution in which the institutions of the old regime, the old state, were swept away. The economic, military, and political institutions were swept away. Chavez is obviously working towards changing those institutions, but a number of those institutions are very, very strong and will be resistant to significant change, and particularly the economic structures in Venezuela and the setup of the oil economy that they have. There's obviously a different era afoot here. Fidel Castro came to power in the 1960s, the middle of the Cold War, agitation in Latin America, upheaval, insurrection. The Cold War is over. There is no Soviet patron. Chavez himself wants to be the patron, if you will, of other countries in Latin America. Does that mean he becomes the equivalent of the Soviet Union in the 21st century in Latin America? Hardly. Only the most extreme right-wing ideologue could make that kind of argument. But truth be told, Hugo Chavez is the new nemesis for the United States. And he represents a real challenge to U.S. influence in the region, which, for all of you who have followed it, is on the wane in any case, not only in Latin America, but around the world, for factors that have nothing to do with Chavez or Latin America, but have much to do with the way the Bush administration has acted in the world and the way the world has largely reacted to the many things that have gone on in the past 3 or 4 years. Chavez, I think, is a real challenge to U.S. influence. Is he a threat to U.S. national security interests? I don't believe so. But is he a challenge to U.S. influence in the region? What of it that remains? I would say he is, and I would say he wants to be, clearly. He is a populist with an internationalist and regional agenda, and he is, unlike Fidel Castro ever was, somebody who has $50 billion in income a year from petroleum to exercise what has come to be known as petrodiplomacy. And that makes him very, very different from Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro had charisma. Fidel Castro had a model of revolution. He had a flair. He had a strategy for insurrection and influence. He had also kind of a great public relations for certain parts of the world that, frankly, Chavez doesn't have. But he did not have the resources that Venezuela has. Hugo Chavez is spending at this point $26 billion in a foreign aid program for Latin America. Significant parts of that money are going to Brazil, they're going to Argentina, and they're going to Cuba. Cuba is working with Venezuela on international aid programs, particularly medical programs. There is Operación Milagro, which some of you have heard about, which Cuban eye doctors with Venezuelan support have gone into a number of countries in Latin America and are performing free eye care in many rural areas that have not had this type of care before. Cuba and Venezuela have what a very prominent Cuban economist, Pedro Monreal, calls a Bolivarian matrix of interaction, of economic interaction, where Cuba provides the services of its trained doctors and other healthcare officials in Venezuela, and Venezuela provides a lot of very low-cost oil a year, a lot of bartering, and significant economic support to Cuba. one of the things we were told when I was in Cuba 2 weeks ago is that, in fact, Cuba is probably doing more to help Chavez kind of advance his ideal of revolution in Venezuela by providing the thousands of medical personnel into the rural areas of Venezuela than Venezuela is actually doing to help the Cuban Revolution itself. Chavez did not have really as well of an organized strategy for advancing kind of his social causes in Venezuela without the kind of the structure and help and contribution of the Cubans. And of course, Chavez is trying to exercise his influence here in the United States as well. I don't know if the Venezuelan ambassador, Bernardo Alvarez, has arrived in Vermont yet with the offer of discount heating oil for the rural sectors, but he has arrived in Massachusetts and in upstate New York, and Chavez is trying to bring his influence through petrodiplomacy here as well. There is no doubt that Chavez has been influential in the region. A year ago, when you and I first met, I was on the plane going up to the conference we were attending together, and there was a free copy in LaGuardia Airport of a very elite magazine called Latin Finance, which is directed at all the kind of stockbrokers and venture fund managers that deal with Latin America, invest in Latin America. And basically the cover story was on who was the most influential leader in all of Latin America and all of the Americas. Where was George Bush? He was number 6. Who was number 1? Hugo Chavez. Chavez has been able to use petrodiplomacy to thwart the United States in the U.S. effort to get its candidate elected to be executive director of the OAS 2 years ago. He totally overshadowed George Bush at the Mar del Plata conference, economic summit in Argentina that was held a year ago. He has become a new banker in the region. He has obviously contributed to the stabilization of Evo Morales' government in Bolivia. He's obviously using petrodiplomacy also in Nicaragua, has a hand in support for Daniel Ortega. And this has led, of course, to the kind of ideological right in this country expressing extreme distress about Cuba and Venezuela and their activities in the region. And I just wanted to share with you an article that Otto Reich, who was Assistant Secretary for Latin America, but then left the Bush administration. And the first thing he did after leaving was wrote an article in the National Review called "Latin America is Terrible Too. Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez constitute an axis of evil." And his position was that the reality that U.S. policymakers must confront, and I'm quoting, and our most pressing specific challenge is neutralizing or defeating the Cuban-Venezuelan axis with the combination of Castro's evil genius, experience in political warfare, and economic desperation, and Chavez's unlimited money and recklessness. The peace of this region is in peril. This was written in April of 2005. We're now at the end of 2006. And I think we've seen that kind of doomsday scenario, kind of the domino effect, the domino theory idea for Latin America, has not come to fruition and is not really going to come to fruition, even if there are progressive candidates elected in significant countries in the region. And we've witnessed in the last year the limits of Hugo Chavez's influence. Most recently, he set out to win Venezuela a seat at the United Nations. You'll all remember his own speech there. And he was defeated. The U.S. candidate, Guatemala, was defeated also. They settled on Panama instead. Chavez-backed radical left candidates in presidential elections in Peru and in Mexico. Both of them lost in part because Chavez himself became a campaign issue and the opposition candidates deftly used his presence, his intervention, if you will, in those campaigns to kind of whip up the nationalist sentiment against the candidates that Chavez was supporting. Even more recently, kind of the lack of diplomacy of Chavez's ambassadors in Chile and Argentina have led to them being ejected from those countries. And Chavez has come to find out that Latin America, just as it hated Spanish colonialism, just as there's nationalism against U.S. economic and political and military intervention, doesn't like to have a prominent leader of another major Latin American state deciding that certain candidates should win or certain things should be said about the political parties that are there. And he's finding this out slowly but surely. The number one limitation for Hugo Chavez is his mouth. And I was in New York when he was there at the United Nations. He not only made his famous speech in which he called Bush the devil, but then he went the next day to a church in Harlem and even elaborated further on this. And that led to huge front page stories in all the tabloid New York newspapers. And I had a copy of the New York Post, and I couldn't find it to bring it with you, but it was a huge front page, bold headline that said, "New York to Chavez, zip it." And even the kind of leading leftist liberal members of the Democratic Party, Charles Rangel of New York, came out and said, Hugo Chavez can't come into my district and say these things about my president. So you have a sense that Chavez managed to whip up nationalism even among a leading Democrat who dislikes George Bush intensely to say that. Hugo Chavez is not what we would call a practitioner of the art of diplomacy. Many of you have read his statements. I don't know if you saw him on his television show one night talking about Bush. He called him a burro. He called him a cobarde. He called him an alcoholic, a borracho. Then he called him those things all over again. There was one interview he did with the BBC where he said, "The imperialist, genocidal, fascist attitude of the U.S. president has no limits. I think Hitler would be like a suckling baby next to George Bush." These are things that frankly, Fidel Castro never would have quite put it that way. And these are, this is an expression of language which, certainly does have an impact. I think it has had a counterproductive impact on the way the rest of the region has come to look at Chavez. And it certainly had an impact on the vote at the United Nations for Venezuela's seat. Now, let me just say that, of course, the United States government and entities in the United States are not absolved from this kind of rhetoric either. Donald Rumsfeld did compare Hugo Chavez to Hitler, although not with the same kind of verbiage that Chavez compared Bush. The United States has characterized Venezuela as a state that is not doing enough to fight terrorism. We have terminated military aid to Venezuela on that basis. We have blocked Venezuela's ability to purchase military equipment, planes from Spain, and we're endeavoring to block sales of military equipment from Brazil to Venezuela. There was the famous statement by Pat Robertson, which created quite a hoopla a year or so ago. Robertson, let me see if I can read it to you. How many of you remember Robertson's statement on Chavez? Robertson on his show, his religious show, called for Chavez to be assassinated. He said, I don't know about this doctrine of assassination, but if he thinks we're trying to assassinate him, I think we really ought to go ahead and do it. It's a whole lot cheaper than starting a war. And And I don't think any oil shipments will stop. But this man is a terrific danger in the United States. This is our sphere of influence, and we can't let this happen. We have the Monroe Doctrine. We have the ability to take him out. And I think the time has come that we exercise that ability. And then in a reference to the war in Iraq, we don't need another $200 billion war to get rid of one strong-arm dictator. It's a whole lot easier to have some of the covert operatives just do the job and get it over with. Well, this statement created a huge brouhaha at the time. The Bush administration was somewhat slow to repudiate it, and only did in the kind of softest of terms after it became a major media event. One could be left with the impression that there is no there there, that Chavez doesn't have any real reason to be so angry at the United States. But I just brought a couple of documents to show you the basis of his animosity towards the Bush administration. And that has to do with the attempted coup against him in April of 2002. We still don't have the declassified record of what really happened during this coup. But using the Freedom of Information Act, some scholars in Washington have been able to get some extraordinary documents out. You've all heard of the Presidential Daily Brief, which is called the PDB, which goes to about 11 or 12 people at the highest level of the administration, the top person being the Presidential Daily Brief. This is the second most important type of document that gets distributed to national security managers. It's called the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief. And a whole series of these briefs were done on Venezuela in the spring of 2002, leading up to the coup. And each one of them was done by something called the Strategic Warning Committee, which is a committee, an interagency intelligence committee that's headed by the CIA, which is put together to actually warn the highest level policymakers about upcoming events so that they can actually be ready. And the Bush administration left the impression after the coup attempt in April of 2002 that it was totally taken by surprise by this. But in fact, it knew the coup was coming and had clearly, and this is the record we still don't have yet, prepared what its kind of statement and how to handle this was going to be. And this is the most detailed of the documents that were declassified. You see, it's a top secret document, even though it doesn't have a lot of really top secret information in it. But what it does have is this is dated on April 7th or 8th. And what it does have is obviously the details of what the coup planning is going to be, right down to how many people were going to be arrested and what the pretext for the coup was going to be. It was going to be tied to the strikes that were taking place. And so there was very concrete intelligence. Some people in Venezuela interpreted this document to mean that the CIA was part of this planning process. But the document in and of itself is simply the routine things that a high-level intelligence agency does, which is gather intelligence from sources and report that back to superiors in Washington. So this document in and of itself does not leave us with any evidence of the U.S. role. Now, a couple of other transparencies. Of course, I don't know where they are. The State Department did a 28-page chronology of events leading up to the coup and events during the 2 days of the coup and after the coup. And for the most part, this was statements that were made, meetings that were held. You get to the 2 days, April 11th and April 12th, which were the days that the coup actually took place and Chavez was out of power. And what do you have? Absolutely blacked out pages. Not a single word on those pages. All of that information from the State Department withheld as being too sensitive to release. And that's just the State Department. If you've got a chronology of CIA activities during that time or Defense Department activities during that time, you probably would have even more evidence, withheld, of course, but obviously there, underneath the blacked out sections, of quite a bit of U.S. activities in support of that coup. And it remains for those of us in my office to continue to work to get that material declassified so we know what really happened. That is really part of the significant basis of Chavez's animosity towards the United States, is his deep perception that the United States was involved in trying to support a coup against him. Those of you who have studied this will remember what happened. The masses of people came out, Chavistas came out in the streets to support him when he was removed from power. The Organization of American States immediately convened and blasted the United States for seeming to be equivocal about supporting, about actually endorsing this move against a democratically elected leader. And the United States was forced to back off its support for the change in regime in Caracas. And due to the protests in the streets, the military officers who had removed Chavez within 48 hours decided to bring him back. And he has gained in strength ever since. For the most part, over the last year or so, if you set aside Don Rumsfeld, the U.S. government has adopted a kind of low-key position rhetorically on Chavez. I think they have come to understand that the more they just let him bluster, the more he becomes his own worst enemy in the eyes of the international community. And so, not to inflame the situation, U.S. policymakers have said very little. Of course, there are things going on behind the scenes. The CIA has named a special task force to monitor intelligence related to Venezuela and to Cuba and their activities in the region. The U.S., as I say, has been pressuring other governments not to sell military equipment to Venezuela. And there is just, a difficult situation between the two countries. But all of that is beside the main relationship of the United States and Venezuela. How many of you own a car? A few of you. How many of you fill up at the Citgo station? Well, those of you who go to Citgo are giving money straight to the state petroleum organization of Venezuela. You are contributing to that $24 billion foreign aid program that Chavez has in Latin America, and to the $50 or so billion that Venezuela takes in from its oil exports. And Venezuela exports almost 60% of its oil output to the United States, and the United States is buying 11% of its total purchases in oil from abroad from Venezuela. And this is a relationship that is very, very hard to break for either country. Chavez has, from time to time, threatened that relationship, but most analysts believe that it is very, very impossible for him to. It is totally impossible for him to follow through on this and not essentially sabotage his own project, his own agenda for the type of aid and influence he wants to have, not only in Latin America but in Venezuela as well. So the likelihood is we are going to stay in this kind of ongoing type of tense relationship with a lot of rhetoric, particularly from the Venezuelan end. What do we do? What to do about Hugo Chavez? Otto Reich talks about the genius of evil in Fidel Castro, but Castro is passing from the scene. The relationship with Raúl is not going to be the same, obviously. Chavez is going to try and assume that mantle, fill that vacuum that Castro once held some years ago. So what to do about Venezuela? The Council on Foreign Relations has just released a new report, which if any of you are interested in this topic, I highly recommend to you. And it's a comprehensive overview of the relationship of Chavez to Latin America, of Chavez's policies in Venezuela, and of the United States policy towards Venezuela. And basically, the United States, as of Sunday, will confront a reality. Chavez will have been reelected with a fairly significant margin. He has a substantive agenda, which he will try to accelerate. The United States can exacerbate the tensions inside Caracas and inside the region if it if it really wants to, or it can sit back and join the rest of the Latin American community in its approach to Venezuela. And the Council on Foreign Relations recommends basically that the United States go ahead and offer a set of olive branches to Chavez. If he rejects them, then the rest of the world, the rest of the region sees that the United States is trying to change its policy and Chavez is staying with the old disreputable hostility. No rhetoric towards Venezuela from U.S. officials. Invite Chavez and Venezuela to join certain international economic entities. Basically cut back on the National Endowment for Democracy money that is going to specific opposition groups in Venezuela, or for the most part subject that money, those fundings, to scrupulous oversight so that Chavez can't claim, as he has said very often, that this is an explicit form of U.S. intervention to undermine his government. The Council has recommended a more regional approach to Chavez, meeting with governments of Chile and Mexico and Argentina and Brazil, countries that do have influence with Chavez and significant relations with Chavez. I think one of their more controversial recommendations is that the United States should open a discussion with other regional leaders on how to respond in the event that Chavez crosses certain, quote, red lines, unquote, in his domestic and foreign policy. What is the United States and the regional position going to be if Chavez basically calls for a new constitution which would allow him to remain in power indefinitely? What is the U.S. and the regional response going to be if Chavez steps in even more forcefully than he has to support the Iranian effort to create a nuclear capacity? Those types of questions. But the point that the Council report makes in the end is one that I want to leave you with. And that is that U.S. policy towards Latin America is far more important for lessening Chavez's own influence than U.S. policy towards Venezuela specifically. Latin America, and we're all here because I think we're interested in Latin America, has suffered for years with the same major problems: poverty, instability, political polarization, corruption, crises in governance. The two factors that are most important and have led to Chavez having the influence that he has, expending his petrodollars in other countries, are, of course, the vast discrepancy of income, unequal distribution of wealth in Latin American countries, and sheer poverty in a number of these countries. And these are issues that have been around forever. I just want to leave you with a historical story. I wish I had the documents to show you, but I don't have them. And I just want to finish with a historical story about Fidel Castro, which I don't think many people know. A number of you who have studied the Cuban Revolution know that after the revolution and Fidel took power in January of 1959, Castro was actually invited to Washington in April, 3 months later, to speak at the National Press Club. And he came to Washington. He met with Richard Nixon in a very famous meeting. He gave a speech at the National Press Club. He took the train up to Princeton and gave a long talk there. I met some guy from Princeton in a nursing home, if you can believe it, who told me that he was at this speech and that they were tugging on Castro's arm to get him to stop talking. So even at 3 months into the revolution, he was already giving, hour, 2 hour, 3 hour speeches that were inappropriate for the forum. And then he went to New York City, and he was kicked out of the Waldorf Astoria and went to the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, and there was big mobs of people. He was very, very popular. Hugo Chavez himself, when he came last year to New York for the UN meeting, also decided to go to the Hotel Teresa and kind of repeat this historical presentation that Castro had made so popular so many years before. But what people don't know about this trip is that during this trip, Fidel Castro met with 2 CIA officers. And the CIA at the time had a kind of I would like to say a split over how they saw Fidel Castro, but really the majority of people in the CIA at that time actually saw Castro as a fairly romantic revolutionary. One CIA officer who I actually took to Cuba for the Bay of Pigs conference, a very high-level officer named Robert Reynolds, who was on the Caribbean task force that was following the Cuban Revolution, said across from the conference table to Fidel Castro, he said, "I was a Fidelista." And a number of members of my CIA task force, we were all Fidelistas because we knew Batista was a pig and corrupt and brutal, and you looked like a pretty romantic figure, a real Democrat, until you lined all those people up against the wall and shot them. And then I changed my position on you. This was the kind of history that was being shared at this conference. But the CIA met with Castro during his trip in April of 1959, and they said to him, "We think that you are truly going to be the spiritual leader of democratic forces in Latin America. But we think you need some help. We think you don't really understand that there are communists in and around your government who want to take advantage of you and circumvent you and steal your power. Why don't we set up, a system so we can talk to you about this?" And Castro said, "Sure, let's." Castro, who of course knew who all the communists were, and this was not like news to him, but he just played the CIA people along. He said, "Sure, let's set up a back channel, and you can tell, pass information into my government about who you think those awful communists are." And for a little while, the CIA actually did this. But in this conversation, this meeting with Castro, the CIA made this point about the dangers of the communist forces, and Castro responded in a way that's truly the same issue for today. He said, "You are so worried about the spread of communism in Latin America, but what you really should be worried about is the level of poverty in Latin America. What you need for Latin America is a U.S. Marshall Plan for the entire region. If you really want to change the situation, if you really want to defeat the forces that you seem so preoccupied about, then go ahead and put your money where your mouth is and have a Marshall Plan, a vast investment. Cuba is not asking for any aid," he said to them, "but the rest of Latin America could truly benefit from a massive influx of U.S. economic support." And he said, "You are missing what the true problems here are: poverty and unequal distribution of wealth." And that's what he said in April of 1959 in a secret meeting with the CIA. And that is the root of the problem today in Latin America. That is the kind of magnet of Chavez's appeal and his ability to have influence where the United States no longer has influence. And that is what has not changed in the 50 years since the Cuban Revolution. I will stop there. I thank you for listening. And I'm sure that there are people who have their own insights and opinions on these issues, and I would be delighted to hear them. Shall we start here?
Sure. Just a two-part question, if you'll indulge me. After the GA meeting this year, where Chavez made that famous speech, there was a bit of press about him being friendly with Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And I'm curious, first, as to what you see the two countries having to offer each other, Iran and Venezuela, if anything. And secondly, whether it seems as though in this post-2006 election environment, there's a possibility of a change in U.S. rhetoric in terms of Iran, at least with regards to Iraq, and whether there's a possibility with Democrats controlling more of the national government again, whether there's a possibility of a moderation of the U.S. position towards Venezuela rhetorically for the same reasons.
Hugo Chavez has gone out of his way to cozy Venezuela up to Iran. They're both in the oil business, and he has supported Iran's nuclear program, I think in part because it's a way to say to the United States, there are other countries out there, and I'm going to support them be as independent as they want to be. Hugo Chavez, I don't believe, sees a problem with Iran having a nuclear weapon. He certainly doesn't see the situation the same way as the United States does. And other countries around the world, do see the situation differently than the United States. There are many countries out there who feel that just because the United States, one thing for a country like the United States that already has nuclear weapons to say to another country, you shouldn't be allowed to have them. Other countries say, well, we are independent and we should decide for ourselves what our energy needs are and what our military needs are. So Chavez is going out of his way to draw attention to his support for Iran as it becomes increasingly under pressure from the United States and the international community for its nuclear program. And I think he sees a possibility of an alliance there, and the kind of decisions that are made about oil output can be made more easily, and the price of oil can be determined as well the more support he has in the OPEC countries and with Iran. So there are a lot of advantages to Venezuela to have that relationship. Will this change under the new Congress? Is that what your second question is?
Will the U.S.'s rhetorical hostility towards Venezuela?
Well, one of the points that I tried to make is that aside from Donald Rumsfeld and people like Pat Robertson and Otto Reich, who aren't actually in government, there has been there's clearly in the State Department, at least, there's a strategy not to really respond rhetorically to Chavez. That he is shooting himself in the foot, and the United States would just get in the way of the bullet if it itself started to respond in kind. So it would just assume him continue to shoot himself all over his body, with his rhetorically, then bring the attention back to the United States. Behind the scenes, of course, I think we're still pursuing a policy of hostility towards Nicaragua, towards Venezuela. Will there be a difference? This is something that I think is very important to note, and I think the Venezuelans themselves think that they will build some type of movement of support in the United States that will somehow impede what Chavez himself sees as kind of the imperial, aggression of the United States in Venezuela. I do not see that, and that is what the episode in New York with Charles Rangel and others showed. You are not going to get even senators and congressmen who would stand up right forward and say, we must normalize relations with Cuba. It doesn't really matter whether it's Fidel or Raul. It is in our interest to normalize relations with Cuba. I do not believe will stand up and defend Chavez at this point. Does that mean that the United States will go and send the Marines into Caracas? No, because there are all these other factors, including his election and the international perspective on armed aggression and the economic ties that would be disrupted between Caracas and Washington, the United States and Venezuela. But will Hugo Chavez ever have a significant kind of caucus of friends in the U.S. Congress? I don't believe it will ever happen. And I say that as somebody who's lived in Washington for almost 30 years and has seen the coalitions of solidarity and support that have been built for the Sandinistas, for the Cubans, for the Bolivians that are being built now, etc. It just isn't going to happen for the Venezuelans. I personally don't believe. Others of you might have a different assessment, but that's my analysis from Washington.
Let's see if we can get several questions and you could respond to several. Let's start here. domestic dissent and economic issues. Thank you, Eduardo. A couple of others, very quickly.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what kind of future relations between Venezuela and China you might see or predict, how the U.S. might respond to that.
Issues to the success of Chavez's social policies because of poverty and corruption of the policies of the Venezuelan government. Has he done anything or been successful in these issues?
Do you see Latin American countries responding to Venezuela's foreign aid program versus taking development money from organizations like the IMF and IMF?
This is an interesting question that we're going to see. One of the things that that happened in Argentina, for example, is that Argentina renounced kind of its IMF obligations, and Chavez stepped in and said, "I will buy $3 billion worth of your bonds to inject that money back in and to help you recover from the loss of that particular relationship." And I think that he basically, there's really no strings attached there. There's no, when the IMF, as you know, comes in and it says we're going to loan you this money, but you have to have structural reconditioning and this is actually what led to Chavez becoming the person that he became, the popular figure that he became, is that the IMF came into Venezuela in the early 1990s to help out an economic crisis there and said, you have to stop subsidizing public transportation, you have to raise the price of gasoline, you have to do this and that, and we'll give you this money. And so Carlos Andrés Pérez did this, and there was this huge set of protests. People were in the streets, the military fired on them, a couple hundred people were killed. And Chavez tried to lead a coup at that point, which failed, and he was thrown in jail. But as he was going to jail, and this was very similar to Castro when he made his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech after he attacked the Moncada barracks in 1953, as he was going to jail, Chavez gave a speech. It got national attention, and people started to focus on him, and he came back to decide that he wasn't a golpista, but he was going to be a candidate for the presidency. So I think that Chavez can perhaps have an impact on the type of conditionality that the IMF does use in the future, and we'll see what happens. Most countries, I don't know whether Venezuela is going to be able to bail out every country that's running into an economic crisis, but we'll have to see. Chavez is using some of the oil money as much as he can to do these social programs, misiones. He calls them misiones bolivarianos, Bolivarian missions. And they're basically social programs. A lot of it is healthcare, a lot of it is education, a lot of it involves some of it involves Cuban contributions, particularly in the healthcare department, literacy campaigns. There is an impact on the poor. Any of you who have traveled to Venezuela know that there is some incredible poverty there, and that you have a country that has been wealthy for many, many years, and the oil wealth has just been squandered by the upper classes in a way that is so disheartening. How many people have been to Caracas? You live there. Well, you should say more than I. I lived there in 1977 myself, and then I went back this past April. But Caracas could be a model of a modern capital city in Latin America, because certainly Venezuela has had the money for that. And instead, it's this disparate set of dark buildings and disjointed buildings with no kind of center. And you go through it if you can, because the traffic jams are absolutely impossible, and the smog too. You go through it and you think to yourself, how could you redo this? How could you replan this urban setting? And I personally came away thinking you couldn't. You'd have to raise the entire city and start all over again to actually come up with a plan. And there's no zoning, there was kind of no planning, and this was just emblematic of the way this vast wealth has been lost for all these years, leading to a situation where somebody like Chavez can become as popular among the poor in a country like Venezuela. So I can't give you the statistics on the advances that have been made, but there have been some advances. They're not as substantive as one would think. And you are hearing in Venezuela, why are we spending all this money in the rest of Latin America when we need it here? We need more of it here. And that is becoming more and more pronounced. Will that lead to him falling from grace? I doubt it, because he has enough money at this point to do both. If a barrel of oil falls from $65 or $60 to $40 over a period of a couple of years, then you might find that the situation becomes somewhat different for him, and he will have to choose between vast expenditures in other parts of the world in Latin America and expenditures on social programs at home. I remember your question, but I don't remember yours.
Venezuela and China.
Venezuela and China. China is, one can talk about the kind of challenge to U.S. influence in Latin America that Venezuela might pose. China truly is the new kind of economic superpower in Latin America, not just in terms of its relationship with Venezuela, but its relationship with a lot of countries. It's becoming the primary investor in Chile. It's becoming a substantive and has been a substantive investor in Peru. In Cuba, it's got a number of programs and investments planned. And in Venezuela, there is a plan to sell up to quite a bit of oil. I don't remember, it was 500,000 barrels a month to China. That would be a huge step up from, I think, what is 200,000 barrels a month, or maybe a day. I have to look at my stats here. But a vast increase in the amount of oil that China would buy. And China is planning all sorts of investments. It's already brought a factory and is contributing to a refinement factory, and is setting up 12 offshore pumping platforms to enhance future Venezuelan oil output. So the economic relationship between China and Venezuela will soon grow to be probably the most prominent economic relationship that Venezuela has. And that's not limited to Venezuela, though. That is across the board what is happening in Latin America and even some other countries as China becomes a huge economic powerhouse. The dissident factor in Cuba is obviously a very relevant one. You mentioned Osvaldo Paya and his $100,000 signatures. That was done several years ago, however, that particular 4 years ago. I met him about 3 years ago in Havana and talked to him, and he's a wonderful person and is obviously doing something very, very important in Cuba. The problem is, of course, is that after he did that, a number of the other dissident groups had been infiltrated by Castro's agents. 75 members of them were arrested and put in jail. These are groups that are not widely known to be well organized. Even though they do exist, they are not well organized. They are not, although Paya himself is very courageous, some of the other dissidents have been, I'd say, less than bold in the work that they've done. And I have to tell you that even though you are absolutely right that there are people on the ground, many Cubans who are fed up with the situation. They're not fed up with the political situation. They're fed up with the daily issues about making an income and about having to kind of scurry around and find creative ways to bring in money to buy food and equipment and goods on the black market. There is a corruption factor in Cuba because really the only way to go ahead and make ends meet is to steal from the state and sell that material, whether it's gasoline, whether it's food from agricultural co-ops, tires, etc., sell that on the black market. And one of the things that became clear of the change from Fidel to Raúl was that the Cuban government was going to acknowledge this issue acknowledge that corruption wasn't just some individual who wasn't sufficiently, an idealist, who wasn't sufficiently communist, who wasn't sufficiently the new man, and admit that this was a systemic problem in Cuba. And the Cuban communist youth newspaper Juventud Rebelde ran a 3 or 4 part series, very comprehensive, saying essentially that. Now, one can say it, and that is a significant thing for Cubans to read, but then you have to actually do something about it. And from the people on the street that I talked to very high officials, they all understood this dynamic. And it seemed like there was going to be an effort, and that one of the hallmarks of Raul's initial kind of effort, initial steps in power, was going to his trademark was going to start off with dealing with the issue of corruption and trying to make the situation better for the average Cuban, because it is difficult. There's no two doubts. There's no two ways about that. Where I would say, from what we've seen and from the analysts I've talked to, as disgruntled as many Cubans are about their daily situation, there is no organized opposition to Castro, and there is no to Raul either, and there is no sense that this will lead to some type of change, kind of from the bottom up. I think it is interesting, though, that from the top down there is recognition of this and an understanding that Raul's personality won't be enough to kind of hold that together, and that actual changes in the economic structures are going to have to take place. And those are what I think we're going to see very, very slowly in the coming months.